Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is TowerGate day number 617. 617. November 25th, 2018, Sunday. Thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, let's get to it. Well, it looks like Trump is now saying that if it becomes necessary, he will shut down the U.S. border with Mexico. He says that, and this has been reported in the news just today, that the new Mexican president, who I think takes office either Tuesday or Wednesday, has an agreement that they will hold the migrants on the Mexico side of the border. So this fits in with Trump's tweet where he says if it becomes necessary, he will shut down the U.S. border. He says that the migrants must stay in Mexico and that they must go through the legal process to try to get asylum into the U.S. Now that could take up to 5 years. There is currently a waiting list of people, and the number is about 318,000 people waiting in line ahead of these migrants. That's why they could find themselves in that sort of nowhere zone, no man's zone, for up to 5 years, by which time most of them will just turn around and go back, or maybe accept asylum in Mexico, which the new Mexican president has stated he will certainly offer them that. Now, the way the law reads on asylum is that when you leave a country because you think you're being persecuted for your political beliefs or for something like that, that as soon as you get to a neighboring country, that is where you must seek asylum. You're not allowed to skip over 2 or 3 countries to go to another country and try to get asylum there. You must go to the country that's nearest the border of the country that you are fleeing. That's where you must ask for asylum. So they're already in violation of the procedure for seeking asylum anyway. But it appears that the new Mexican president has agreed with the Trump administration that they will hold them on their side of the border, and just to make sure of that, Trump has got the troops down there, and just to make sure of that, he's given them the ability to use force if necessary to defend themselves. And now he's saying he will even shut down the entire U.S.-Mexico border, and I assume that means from California all the way to the Rio Grande. So that's a long-ass distance, but my guess is he'll get it done, because one thing that we know about Trump is that when he says he's going to do something, he does it. So we'll continue to follow the situation. Again, we all understand what the Democratic plan is. We know who's behind this, and it's a plot. It's just a simple, that's all it is. It's a plot. And what they want is to get these migrants on our border and then create this political crisis, which they can use to ride into 2020 again. And again, as I said yesterday, they want to try to turn it into like a Israel-Palestine Gaza Strip sort of issue, where they want to portray these people as being oppressed by the evil Trump and his administration, and try to get sympathy and that sort of thing, and use it as a reason to attack Trump into 2020. So it's largely a political operation from the very get-go. And we know where most voters, when we see the polls, I mean 60%, over 60% believe we need to secure the border. I think most people will see this happening down on the border, and as it continues to go on and on, I think that Trump's position becomes stronger. I think it's a political loser for the Democrats. Trump certainly thinks so. That's why he talked about it so much during the midterms. And but I think the Democrats see it as a winner for their base, and right now that's who they've been playing to their base. And as they move into an election year, they'll do the same. Most political parties do play to their base. I mean, they have to get their base energized. First and foremost, the first thing you have to do is you have to get your base on board with you. Make sure they're all happy. Make sure they're where you want them to be. And then you start trying to reach into the independents. You try to cross over. That's why you'll see at the beginning of any political campaign, politicians almost always play to their hard base, and then once they feel they've got a good handle on that and they see the numbers are where they want them, then they begin to moderate toward the end of the election cycle. They moderate and move back toward a more centered position where they try to pick up in the independents and maybe even pull a few from the other side on some niche issues or something like that. So this is just politics as usual. It's just a shame that these people are being used because, quite honestly, they're the people who are unfortunately going to suffer the most and lose the most, because they're not going to get across the border. It's not going to happen quickly. They could be, as I said, up to 5 years waiting to even get their hearing. And how many of them people are going to hang around in those conditions for 5 years? They're likely, most of them, going to at some point just walk away and find some little town in Mexico, or maybe go back down toward Guatemala or somewhere else, and they might, take up residency somewhere else. Many of them might even go back home, because let's face it, they were never under really any political persecution, and they know it. They were just hoping that they could get enough of them that they could charge the border, and they were playing the odds that many of them, hey, maybe they'll get me, maybe they won't. Maybe I'll get over. They might get some of us, but they're not going to get all of us. I'm hoping I'll be one of the people who will squeeze through. This is pretty much the tactic that they had. So that is the situation on the border as it stands right now. Trump is clearly standing up. He's not backing down, and this is why he's going to continue to maintain high popularity with his base. Huge riots in France today. There have been riots, but today was the biggest, and particularly in Paris. And this, of course, is stemming from the fuel tax that Macron put on. Now, it's really two things here. It is the fuel tax itself and the drawbacks to that, and the problems that creates for a lot of people in France. They're taxed enough as it is already, and they really don't like the fuel tax. But I think what bothers them the most is the fact that this was an edict from the EU. This was more of a directive from the EU to Macron. This is what we want you to do. And he's carrying the water for the technocrats at the EU. So it's really two things. It's the fuel tax itself and the damage it creates for a lot of these people who are already overly taxed and very unhappy about his migration policy and various other things. Of course, we know he's sitting around 22-23% popularity. He's definitely on the rocks. But this issue has pushed people, and again, it's really two elements of one thing here. It's the fuel tax, but it's also the fact that it was an edict from the EU that Macron dutifully followed like a handmaiden, doing as he was directed by the technocrats at the EU, which goes back to that sovereignty issue, goes back to that nationalism, populist movement that's all over Europe, and now it is showing its face in France. It's always been there. I think a lot of the Marie Le Pen people were already activated in this group, but now more and more people are coming to that particular side of things. So there's a lot going on here. They're using water cannons, they're using tear gas, and I think the group that's really behind the major push behind these protests, particularly the big ones in France, I think these people call themselves the Yellow Jackets. I don't know, maybe that's because they wear yellow jackets. I'm not really sure what that means, but anyhow, they are calling for Macron to leave. They want Macron to go. So when people are heading into the streets, and the numbers are I haven't seen anyone give an estimate on the numbers, but I saw the video clips, and it's a hell of a lot of people. I mean, Paris is just the view I saw is just, it's hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, it's a lot of people, and you know how the French are. I mean, when the French protest, they're a fairly violent group of people. When they protest, they get really rowdy and unruly, and they start garbage cans on fire. They turn over cars. They spray paint things on buildings. You get into a lot of violent stuff going on with the French when they protest, and This is exactly what you see, calling for Macron to step down. They've broken out water cannons. They've broken out tear gas. And Macron, just to show you how arrogant he is not showing any conciliatory tone whatsoever. In fact, his statement is that he's essentially calling on his people to join this scrum and for them to come out in the streets. So he's calling on those who are anti-nationalist or opposed to the populist movement that's sweeping Europe. He's calling on them to join in and to counter this so-called Yellow Jackets group, calling for him to step down, and rioting over this major issue, the fuel tax, and of course the underlying issue behind that, which is that it was an edict from the EU to Macron. And of course Macron is auditioning to be a top tier guy at the EU, maybe head of the EU. He's kind of bucking for Merkel's position is what he's doing. But the thing is, when Merkel got her position, and for the most part during the long period of time she held her position, her party and she was pretty popular, and her party was pretty popular up until about 3 or 4 years ago when you started to see her slip, and then of course it's been a steady decline. Macron has never had that kind of popularity, and I don't know if the EU looks at him the same way they looked at Merkel. And of course, Germany is the powerhouse economy of the EU, and pretty much the seat of power in the EU. I mean, the EU is essentially the EU and Germany are kind of a partnership in a way, and they're like the top tier, and everything else is below them. Well, France is just not there. So the idea that Macron, believes that he can step in and replace Merkel, that's not going to happen. It's likely going to be Schultz or Van Rompuy or one of these other people. I just don't see it happening. Macron's got a long way to go. I mean, he's still got 3.5 years left in his term. I don't know how he's going to make it 3.5 years when he's sitting at 22% now. He's got people rioting in the streets calling for him to leave. He's sticking with a very unpopular policy. He's completely against the current moving across the EU is a populist nationalist movement. He is a strong opposition voice to it. I mean, he is literally going to be swept away in the strong current, and I'm not sure if he finishes his 3.5 years. I don't know what the procedure is in France for a leader. I don't know. Usually what they do if they want to get rid of a leader in France, they just drop some criminal charges on them, because they're all criminals. They all have a lot of stuff going on, and I don't know about Macron, how dirty he is, but this is typically how they get rid of politicians in France. They set them up. If they can't find a crime on them, they just set them up. It's really dirty, like in most politics. So it'll be very interesting to watch. It'll also be very interesting to watch and see if Macron's, the way he's handling this, if he actually ends up, and I think this could very likely happen, if he actually ends up motivating the sort of sleeping giant in France, which is the sort of common man in France, who is really the one taking the brunt of the effects of the bad policy, of the migration policy, of the fuel tax, of many of Macron's policies. It's really the common man, which is the dominant number of voters in France. This is really a lot of the people who even voted for him. So I'm not sure. Again, I don't live in France. I visited there a couple times, but I don't know that much about the inner workings of French politics. But it seems to me, just in politics in general, when you're sitting at 23%, people are rioting in the streets telling you to step down, and you are not responding. Because, in American politics, when a president's sitting at 22% and people are, protesting and whatever, generally a U.S. president will listen to that and political people around him will say, hey, you got to capitulate, you got to back up and punt, you've got to soften your position, you've got to address this group of people, or whatever. But it does not appear that that's what Macron is doing. It appears he's doubling down, and I think it's because I don't think Macron, again, I think Macron is looking at a much bigger prize, and I think that is that he sees the EU as, I think he sees his presidency in France as a stepping stone to the ultimate power, which is at the EU. I think that's really where Macron is I think that's where he's coming from at this point. So let's keep watching. Things are getting very, very sporty in Paris tonight. Well, this is, of course, no surprise, and this is just one of many that's coming and will continue to come in boatloads. We have the liberal watchdog group, American Oversight. Liberal watchdog group, American Oversight, has now submitted a complaint to the Office of the Special Counsel, wanting Whitaker to be investigated for Hatch Act violations. Let's keep in mind that the head of American Oversight is a former Obama attorney. Okay, so what's this all about? This is standard fare. You can literally go find this on every single politician in every election. And this is a standard thing that happens. So Whitaker was running for the Senate in Iowa. And of course, like most politicians, he had a campaign fund. He had a campaign manager that ran his campaign donations and stuff. So at some point, his Senate campaign ends, and he is named as Sessions' chief of staff at the DOJ. But at some point, he received about $8,000 in donations. At some point, we don't know yet. We don't know the date. This will all be this will all come out as it's investigated or whatever. But this happens in every election, where campaign funds roll in past a certain date. There's campaign funds. Various states handle it in different ways. What usually happens in a lot of states is you can hold on to those funds. They'll usually stay in an account because that politician is usually going to run again in another election in another year or two, and in which case that money will be there, and when they run for the next election, they tap into that money. Some states allow you just to take the money and it's yours. There's various things, and of course the political parties also have certain, not laws, but certain things, like the Democratic Party. They generally want Democrats who raised money for campaigns who did not win, or even, who did not win. A lot of times the Democratic Party will want them to reimburse the Democratic Party with some of that money for efforts the Democratic Party made on their behalf. So you have a lot of things going on. It gets into campaign finance law, but never do you have an IG investigation into something like this. The IG doesn't waste their time on this. This is a simple FEC complaint. It will go to the FEC. The FEC will look at it. They'll look at the date and see when Whitaker officially pulled out of the race, and they'll see when the money came in. When did he actually accept the appointment at the Department of Justice to be Sessions' chief of staff? They'll look at the dates. If the money came in after that date, when he began working for the DOJ, they'll simply say, well, you need to return the money. Now, most of the time what happens is before it ever makes it through the FEC, once the former candidate, has become aware, because most of the time the political candidates don't even know this. It's their campaign finance guy or their campaign chair that keeps track of all this. The politician himself usually isn't really into the nuts and bolts of it that much, and for good reason. They generally don't want to know, okay? Kind of protects them. So likely Whitaker is just now becoming aware of this. But what happens 9 times out of 10 is as soon as they become aware of it, they take a look at the date. They call their former campaign finance chairman and say, yeah, when did that money come in? Okay, well, yeah, I started working for the DOJ here. Okay, I don't plan on running for office again. Just go ahead and send the money back. In which case, they go ahead and send the money back. But there is no, he will not be forced to step down. It will not, the Inspector General won't even handle it. He'll just, he'll just say, no, this needs to go to the FEC and they can look at it or whatever. This is probably one of the most common types of violations that you see. It's generally a case of oversight. The candidate usually doesn't even know. And 9 times out of 10, they just return the money. There's usually not even a fine or any type of punishment or anything like that. It's just, okay, well, you got to give this money back. That's all there is to it. But it's just another case of what we talked about. This is the plan going forward, is to attack Whitaker on every front. And this is why I say to you, Mr. Whitaker, there's no need to be shy, my friend. They're coming after you hard, regardless of what you do. And if they sense any sign of weakness, they'll only come after you even harder. The thing to do, Mr. Whitaker, is to indict these criminals or appoint a special counsel. Indict Hillary. You want to shut this up? Indict Hillary. Watch how they react. Once they realize that you're a serious man and you're not going to put up their bullshit and that you can't be intimidated, you can't be forced off your mark, once they realize that you'll keep your nose to the grindstone and you won't be intimidated, they'll think twice about the type of character they're dealing with, and they'll most likely back off of you. Take action, Mr. Whitaker. Massive action. Go right for the throat, because I can assure you, Mr. Whitaker, if you think that you're just going to say, well, yeah, I could go after these people, but it could cause a lot of political turmoil. They'll all be going after me, maybe after the president. This just could get all real ugly, and maybe it's best just to ride my time out here until Trump chooses a permanent AG, and I'll just sort of, keep the seat warm and try to keep a low profile or whatever. If you think that is somehow going to keep you from being attacked, you're wrong, Mr. Whitaker. That will only say to the Democrats that you're an easy target and you won't fight back. What you need to do, Mr. Whitaker, is indict the rotten Reverend Clinton for violations of the Espionage Act. You need to immediately appoint a special counsel to look into the other things regarding Spygate, and you certainly should be having Mr. Huber in your office immediately, regardless of whether he appears on the 3rd or the 5th or whenever to talk to Congress to answer questions. He won't answer questions. If it's an ongoing investigation, he's not going to talk about it anyway. 15 months, what's he uncovered? But you, Mr. Whitaker, can certainly call Mr. Huber in, because he is under you, and you can say, okay, you've been on this thing for 15 months on the Clinton Foundation. Give me what you got. And if he doesn't have anything, you'll know he's not serious, because you know everything, Mr. Whitaker. You yourself said the Clinton Foundation was a clear pay-for-play scheme. It's time, Mr. Whitaker, to drop the hammer on the rotten Reverend. Whether it's Uranium One, the Clinton Foundation, which it's kind of the one and the same, whether it's the Espionage Act violations, regardless of what it is, the way to get these people off your back is to go after them and start indicting people. Get them so busy defending themselves and trying to figure out what they're going to do about their own situation that they don't have time to go after you anymore. And as far as Obama's little team of lawyers, they're going to go after you and file lawsuits on you day after day after day anyway. Drop everything you got, Mr. Whitaker. It's your very best shot. It's the best play that you've got. Brian Schatz, who is a Democrat from Hawaii, is saying that the Democrats will nominate a progressive in 2020. Well, if that's true, the Democratic Party establishment will not be getting behind that character. They will not even let that person win. I can assure you that. Just like they took out Bernie, they'll take out any other progressive, because they know they can't win in the Electoral College with a progressive. They'll get beat really, really bad. Now, it's awfully early to try to talk about the 2020 election, but a lot of people are chiming in on it, so I thought I might as well give my 2 cents here. We could be looking at a very, very interesting 2020 election, because what you have really is both parties who have serious divisions. Now, in the Republican Party, you have the anti-Trumpers, you have people like Kasich and others who possibly even Mitt Romney, who have hinted, certainly Kasich has come out and stated, he was on The View, and he said, yes, I plan on probably running in 2020. And they said, well, do you think you'll challenge Trump for the Republican nomination? He said, well, probably not, because he's 90% popularity in the party. There isn't much to go for there. So he said, I probably wouldn't run as a Republican if Trump remains as popular as he is. So I would probably throw my hat in the ring as an independent. Well, that means that Kasich would throw his hat in the ring as an independent. Well, he may get 5%. He may even get all 10% of the people who don't really fully support Trump. That's still a very small number. But it might be enough to suck enough votes or siphon enough votes out of Trump that could cost him the election if it is a close election. But when you look at what's happening on the Democratic Party, they're going to be far more divided because they're going to have a very divisive primary. There's 30 to 40 Democrats already committing to running for president, and I understand there's as many as 200 who've come out and said that they are thinking about it. You have billionaires like Steyer, who's saying he may run as an independent. Michael Bloomberg saying he may run as an independent, because they know they likely wouldn't get the nomination of the Democratic Party, because they know the Democratic Party leadership is neoliberals. And neoliberals, of course, are running the party, and of course their money comes from the same characters. But Bloomberg and Steyer are billionaires. They would like Trump run on their own money, and would likely run as independents, because Steyer is way, way to the left of just about everybody in the Democratic field. He's about as far left as you can go. The Democratic Party would never even entertain him, and he knows that. So it might be him who runs. He's got a lot of money, and he's very politically active, and he certainly talked about doing it. And if Steyer throws his hat in the ring, it would be likely as an independent. He might start as a Democrat. He might even get in the Democrat primary. But as soon as he falls out of favor, and that won't take long, as soon as he's gone from there, he will likely go as independent. But I wouldn't be surprised to see him run as an independent from the very beginning. I wouldn't be surprised to see Bloomberg do the same. So it's very likely that we could have a Republican nominee, a Democratic nominee, likely could be the Rotten Reverend Clinton, and then you could likely have two independents, one independent running on the far left as a progressive, and one independent running representing the anti-Trump neocons. So this would set up a very interesting set of dynamics, and I think would hurt the Democratic Party way more than it would hurt Trump. Because Steyer or someone like him in the far left who ran as an independent would split the Democratic vote, because the Democratic Party is kind of split about almost, it's probably 60-40, maybe 60% corporate Democrat, 40% progressive, somewhere in that range. So it would completely split that vote and could result in a massive loss for the Democrats. Plus, there'll be a lot of infighting in the Democratic Party because they all have to stake out their positions for 2020. So a lot to watch here, and a very interesting dynamic could possibly come into play in 2020. Papadopoulos, his tweet for today, he says, if Jim Comey agrees to the below questions in a public testimony, I will agree to testify to the Senate without immunity. Now, he's already testified to the House Intelligence Committee, and he waived his immunity. And he says that it's a win-win for the country. America first. And the questions that he wants Comey to answer are the following. Who had FISA warrants on them in the Trump team during the 2016 election? Who were the people who had FISA warrants on them, Mr. Comey? Will he answer that question? No, he won't. Who is Joseph Mifsud? Will he answer that question? Not truthfully. Next question. If the FBI had any role in my dealings with Charles Tawil. Charles Tawil, of course, is the guy who's believed to be an Israeli agent who also works in cooperation with the CIA and FBI or whatever. He's connected to these intelligence apparatus, and he's the man who gave Papadopoulos the $10,000 that Paps was supposed to have on him when he came back to the States, but he left it with his lawyer, and so therefore it wasn't with him. So Papadopoulos believes that Tawil was working for the FBI to set him up. So again, he wants Comey to answer the question if the FBI had any role in Papadopoulos saying if the FBI had any role in my dealings with Charles Tawil. What he wants to know is, was the FBI involved with Mr. Tawil, who is the one who gave Papadopoulos the 10 grand that Pops and me and many other people believe he was supposed to have with him when he arrived back in the States. That's what the FBI was there to do at the airport. They were there to meet Pops and get the 10 grand. He also wants to know the role of Australia and the UK in the surveillance of the Trump team. Well, he definitely ain't going to talk about that, which is exactly why Comey wants a public hearing, because he will simply say, oh, well, I can't talk about that because that's classified. Every question they ask him, I can't talk about that because that's classified. And every question they ask Loretta Lynch will be, I can't recall. The last time they interviewed her, she answered over 100 times, I can't recall. Here's a couple interesting tidbits I got from a speech that Dan Bongino recently gave to the Washington Press Club. If you haven't seen this little speech, it's pretty good. It's about 35 minutes long, so it's not very long, but he does a pretty good job of capsulizing most of what, or a lot of what, is in his book, Spygate, which I understand is a pretty good book. And so he's kind of going through just the story, kind of the narrative of his Spygate book, and he mentions a couple things that are worth bringing up here. The first is something that I did not know, something new I learned, and this is regarding John Carlin. Now, we talked a lot about John Carlin back in the spring of 2017. We were talking a lot about Carlin because, of course, he was at that time the head man at the DOJ NSD, National Security Division, where they had bottled up a lot of the secret and criminal things they were doing were bottled up in the DOJ NSD, National Security Division. Carlin was head of that. If you remember, the IG tried to dig into that, but Sally Yates wrote a 70-page letter to Horowitz saying, no, you're not allowed to look at the NSD, the DOJ NSD. You're not allowed to go there, and wouldn't let him go there. Now, if you remember, it was also John Carlin, the DOJ NSD, and Carlin, he is the last person to sign off on the FISA warrant, supposedly after it goes through the Woods process, which we don't believe it did, but usually once it goes through the Woods process, then it's John Carlin who would have been the final signatory of the FISA warrant before it went to the FISA court. We know that he signed off on that FISA warrant, and then he very quickly, within a few days, resigned in October of 2016 after signing on to that FISA warrant on Carter Page. Carlin resigns. So we know all that. What I didn't know was that John Carlin, prior to becoming head of the DOJ NSD, was Bob Mueller's chief of staff. John Carlin was Uncle Bob, the executioner's chief of staff, before he took that position at the DOJ NSD. And that's very important if you dig into it and then go backwards a little bit. Don't have time to do that now, but I'm sure you can figure that out for yourself. Another thing that he brought up, which I think we did talk about many months ago when we were talking about Uranium-1 and 10X and all that, but just something that I think we should all keep in mind here is that in that 10X deal, which was connected to the Uranium-1 because it was the exact same people involved in 10X that were involved in Uranium-1, which was an effort by the Obama administration to turn over 25% of America's uranium, which resulted in large donations made to the Clinton Foundation and so and so. We all know all that. Of course, we know that Rod Rodenstein was the lead prosecutor on the 10X case, and we know that they pushed that under the rug and kept it very quiet. Well, Mueller was the FBI director at the time that all this went down. Rosenstein and Mueller together essentially made 10X and uranium-1 go away.